Good morning, I'm Taylor Wilson, and today is Wednesday, September 3rd, 2025. This is USA Today's The Excerpt. Today, a court rejects Trump's use of the Alien Enemies Act to deport Venezuelans. Plus, the U.S. military strikes an alleged drug boat from Venezuela, killing 11 people. And taking a closer look at Smithsonian museums that the president alleges are too woke. A federal appeals court ruled yesterday that President Donald Trump unlawfully invoked the Alien Enemies Act to deport Venezuelans he alleged were part of a criminal gang. A panel of the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals issued a preliminary injunction that blocked the Trump administration from removing a group of Venezuelans under the 18th century law. It's the first federal appeals court to rule directly on Trump's March presidential proclamation invoking the law. That law gives the government powers to detain and deport citizens of hostile foreign nations, but only in times of war or during an invasion or predatory incursion. The Trump administration could ask the entire Fifth Circuit to rehear the case, and it's expected to eventually reach the Supreme Court. The U.S. military killed 11 alleged trained Aragua members aboard a suspected drug boat originating from Venezuela in the southern Caribbean yesterday. The move marked a milestone in increasingly militarized U.S. counter-drug efforts in the region. President Trump secretly authorized military force against drug cartels in early August. Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro, alleged to reporters earlier this week that a naval buildup in the Caribbean indicates that Trump is seeking regime change through military threat. He claimed his country's military is super prepared to face off with American troops if necessary. Trump singled out Maduro in his Truth Social post, claiming that Trained Aragua is operating under the control of Nicolas Maduro. U.S. authorities are offering a $50 million reward for his arrest. A federal judge has blocked President Trump's deployment of the National Guard in California. I spoke with USA Today White House correspondent Bart Jansen to learn more. Bart, always a pleasure. Thanks for hopping on.
Thanks for having me.
So just with the latest news, Bart, what did a judge block here surrounding Trump's National Guard deployment?
Yeah, a federal judge in San Francisco named Charles Breyer, he was a Clinton appointee, ruled that Trump acted unlawfully in deploying the National Guard in California. That was primarily when he mobilized several hundred National Guard troops in the Los Angeles area in June, following some sometimes violent protests against immigration enforcement there. Well, Breyer, the judge, cited an 1878 law. It's got such sort of an unusual name, Posse Comitatus Act, but what it means is traditionally our country has not had military serve as domestic law enforcement. You need special congressional approval or an invocation of the Insurrection Act to get around that prohibition up to now. Trump has argued that he was deploying them to protect federal immigration agents and buildings during those protests in June. But Breyer found that he was not. Breyer said that they were acting unlawfully, that they appeared to be doing it willfully, and that Trump appeared to be trying to create a national police force and make himself the chief of police. The judge said there was no rebellion. There was no indication that civilian law enforcement were unable to respond to the protests. And so he found it intentional and unlawful and ordered a block on that policy, at least for the time being.
Well, Bart, how had the courts previously weighed in on this, and what have we heard from the different players, including the Trump administration, just in terms of how they argue this?
Well, Breyer had earlier tried to block this deployment, and he was overturned by the Ninth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, which spans California and other states in the West. They said that, well, the legal issues still need to be sorted out, but that while the case is argued, that Trump would continue to control the National Guard in the state. Traditionally, governors are the ones who mobilize the National Guard, and then they can perhaps seek federal reimbursement for the cost of those troops. But in this case, Trump mobilized them himself. And so the dispute was basically who gets control over them. Despite that ruling, Breyer held a 4-day trial and found, as we've discussed, that the mobilization was unlawful. And so now we're back with there being a question about who controls the National Guard. He's given them till September 12th to file an appeal. It is expected to be appealed. And this, again, is another issue that could potentially reach the Supreme Court to set guidelines for who does control the National Guard and how can they be deployed at any time.
Well, Trump separately mobilized the National Guard in Washington, D.C., threatened to bring troops to other cities. Bart, what does this judge's ruling mean for other parts of the country now?
Yeah, the DC example is different from California because DC has a unique status as the seat of federal government. And Trump is already the commander in chief of the military, which is part of why he argues that he can deploy the National Guard in California. But he is already the commander of the National Guard in DC. So there was no middleman, call it. In the DC case, Trump could just order the National Guard to do what he said, and they continue to patrol the streets here in the city. We've also seen them spreading mulch and raking leaves in the city parks. So they are out and about, and he takes credit for the reduction in crime, a dramatic drop-off in homicides and in carjackings during the couple of weeks that's been in place. Now, on the horizon, he is threatening to deploy National Guard into other cities, and those governors, Democratic governors in Illinois and in Maryland, have said no thanks. Just on Tuesday, as he was talking to the press, Trump said Chicago is a hellhole right now, Baltimore is a hellhole. And he said, in terms of Chicago, where the mayor has called it tyranny if the president were to send National Guard troops there, and where Governor Pritzker has said that he does not want the National Guard sent to Chicago, Trump says, we're going in.
Strong words there about Chicago. Bart Jansen covers the White House for USA Today. Thanks for the insight, Bart.
Thanks for having me.
Local and state leaders in Illinois quickly responded yesterday to Trump's declaration that he will send the National Guard to Chicago. Democratic Governor J.B. Pritzker said at a news conference that none of this is about fighting crime or making Chicago safer. For Trump, it's about testing his power. The House Oversight Committee has released thousands of pages of documents from the government's investigation of Jeffrey Epstein as the fight over the disgraced financier and sex offenders' files reignited after lawmakers returned to Washington this week. House Oversight Committee Chair James Comer issued a subpoena for the records related to Epstein from the Justice Department on August 5th after a bipartisan group of lawmakers on the panel voted in favor of the measure in July. The release of the initial batch of documents comes after President Trump, once a friend of Epstein, has faced several weeks of criticism over the Justice Department's refusal to release all Epstein documents. USA Today was unable to immediately verify independently how many of the records were new and had not been previously made public, but the documents are unlikely to satisfy Democrats and other Trump critics who have demanded the Department of Justice to close all documents in its possession from the government's Epstein investigation. You can read more with a link in today's show notes. President Trump has said the Smithsonian is too woke. USA Today First Amendment reporting fellow Brianna Frank and several reporting colleagues set out to several of its museums to get a closer look. Hello, Brianna.
Hi, Taylor. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for hopping back on. So what has Trump said? Let's just start here about the Smithsonian and it being too woke. What changes has he pushed for?
So in March, President Trump issued an executive order that called for a more positive portrayal of American history. And he specifically mentioned the Smithsonian Institution in that executive order. And now that was followed in August by a review of the Smithsonian institutions that will conclude by early next year. And in a letter sent to the Smithsonian Secretary, Lonnie Bonch, the administration calls for the institution to help, quote, celebrate American exceptionalism, remove divisive or partisan narratives, and restore confidence in our shared cultural institutions.
All right. Well, Brianna, you yourself visited a couple of these museums. Let's start with the National Museum of American History. This has, of course, been one of Trump's biggest Smithsonian targets. What has he objected to specifically, and what did you find on your visit?
So there's several things that the administration has pointed out about the American History Museum, and some of the items and exhibits that are concerning to them were on display when I visited in late August. One of them was a sculpture that sort of looks like the Statue of Liberty, but she's holding tomatoes instead of a torch and tablet, and that was used in a labor protest about 25 years ago. There's also an exhibit commemorating the anniversary of Title IX that mentions transgender athletes. And others, though, that the administration has pointed to aren't still at the museum. So, for example, it mentions the Upending 1620 exhibit, which closed about 3 years ago, and a Latino history exhibit that had several items the administration took issue with that has also closed in recent weeks.
All right. Well, how about the National Portrait Gallery? I know its director stepped down this summer amid some Trump administration complaints. What has his White House pushed back on here, and how do you compare what he said about the gallery and your reporting experience there for the story?
I didn't find that any of the items the administration was concerned about as it relates to the National Portrait Gallery were actually on display when I went. So they mentioned a performance art series that took place about a decade ago, an oil painting that shows refugees crossing the US border into Texas that wasn't displayed past 2023, and an animation of Dr. Anthony Fauci that's also currently not on display. They also mentioned a painting that they said depicted a quote, transgender Statue of Liberty that was supposed to open in September, but has since been canceled.
All right. Well, shifting gears to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, this has also had Trump's attention. Relatively new museum opened in the 20 teens. How has the White House criticized aspects of its work, and what did USA Today find?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting case because the museum opened in 2017, and the following year, Trump said of this museum that he was, quote, deeply proud of it. He toured it in 2017 and said that it was, quote, a beautiful tribute to so many American heroes. That certainly stands in stark contrast to what we're seeing now from the administration. President Trump has said the Smithsonian institutions focus too much on, quote, how bad slavery was. They cited a graphic that this museum published online in 2020, though they took it down after receiving backlash.
All right. Well, we don't have time to talk about kind of every one of these museum trips that you and your colleagues did for this story, Brianna. But what other takeaways can you share with our listeners from these reporting visits to the Smithsonian museums and what you learned?
We interviewed almost 50 people across 5 different Smithsonian museums, and by and large, the sentiment from them was that they thought these museums tell history in a fair and truthful way. And it was also interesting to hear from supporters of President Trump, one of whom told me, quote, I think there are a lot of legitimate complaints that he has. I don't know that that's one of them, referring to the Smithsonian's.
All right. Interesting piece. Brianna Frank covers the First Amendment for USA Today. Thank you, Brianna.
Thanks, Taylor.
The Manosphere is a collection of podcasters and influencers, pretty much exclusively, if not exclusively male, who preach a mix of essentially self-help fitness and taking control of your life. But critics worry that there's often a misogynistic element to their messaging.
The excuse that they give young men is basically the reason that you feel like this is because of women and because of the way that women treat men and because of the way that men are treated. And that's the sort of underlying message of the Manosphere.
USA Today national correspondent Will Carlis recently traveled to talk with some young men who are fans of Manosphere influencers. Why have they turned to them? You can hear that episode right here today, beginning at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. And thanks for listening to The Excerpt. You can get the podcast wherever you get your audio, and you can email us at podcasts@usatoday.com. I'm Taylor Wilson. I'll be back tomorrow with more of The Excerpt from USA Today.